guys, welcome back. For today's episode, we have invited Mark Chubb, Chair of the Institution of Fire Engineers in the UK, Adjunct Lecturer at John Jay College, and last but not least, Fire Engineer. Mark is one of the most experienced guests we have had the pleasure of speaking with. I can talk for hours about Mark's achievements and his experience in the industry of fire engineering, but I think it is better to find out from Mark himself. Mark, welcome. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for the invitation.
We have lots of things to discuss today, but let's start with your story first. How did you get into fire engineering? When did you first learn about this field?
Well, I first learned about the field of fire engineering from my father, who was a human factors engineer and had a doctorate in systems and industrial engineering. He worked for the U.S. Air Force for more than 2 decades. And as I was nearing high school graduation, I was very interested in the fire service for 2 reasons. One is I didn't quite have a plan for how I was going to pay for college. And I couldn't really decide on my interest. And my father was aware that fire protection engineering had recently been established as a genuine academic discipline. So I graduated from high school in 1980. And by then, we had a couple of programs in the United States that focused on fire protection engineering. So he introduced me to John Bryan, who was then the chair at the University of Maryland. And that struck up an interest. Unfortunately, I didn't take that interest seriously until I had been in the fire service for about 8 years and realized that my career would be quite limited if I didn't continue my education. And I reached a turning point in my fire service career where it became evident to me that I really needed to go out and acquire some new skills and achieve some new experiences to really make myself not only more valuable to employers, but to have a more enriching career.
And you've been in this industry for a while now, and you have extensive experience working in the US and abroad. I'm sure you have noticed some pros and cons of working in this industry. So in your opinion, what are the advantages as well as some disadvantages of working in fire engineering?
I think the principal advantage of fire protection engineering, and I'm going to contrast it here with other fields of engineering, is that I think we're more closely engaged with the people who benefit or are beneficiaries of our efforts than many other engineers. In other words, when we work on problems, we're solving problems that genuinely affect the safety, health, and well-being of everyday people. The users of our work are everyday citizens, not some unseen population, not some remote client. We're not just working on a thing, we're working on a system, and we're doing stuff that's that's both highly accessible but almost invisible, right? We take for granted that the buildings and spaces we occupy have been designed and engineered for our safety, but we rarely recognize what's involved in that. And I think one of the more rewarding parts of being a fire engineer has been having the ability to influence that environment. As far as the cons go, the downside is that our discipline is still relatively small and a bit isolated within the broader engineering community, particularly on the AEC side, architecture, engineering, and construction. And as a consequence, a lot of people don't realize they need a fire engineer until it's quite late in the game. And I think the biggest disadvantage is that many of our clients, and this is where my fire service background is helpful, many of my clients on the private sector side are much like the people who used to call the emergency services when I was in uniform. They have an urgent situation. It's very important to them. It may not be urgent or important for the rest of the community, but for them, it's of critical importance, and they need our help urgently. Unfortunately, our options are often very constrained. Our ability to develop solutions for them that are optimal or preferential often has faded by the time that they choose to engage us. And I think that's probably the biggest disadvantage, the biggest con. If we could get people to understand our discipline more, become better integrated with others in the AEC space, I think we could do more good for more people.
Exactly. And I want us to discuss now something related to the fire services. We know you've been traveling frequently, and apart from working in the US, you spent a few years in New Zealand with the fire services, as you mentioned before. And can you tell us how was your experience as a fire engineer working in New Zealand versus the one in the United States?
Sure. Well, the good news is that fire behaves the same in the Northern Hemisphere as the Southern Hemisphere. The laws of physics still apply the same in both hemispheres. So even though we're upside down, depending on your perspective in one hemisphere versus the other, the world still operates much the same way. The fire services, on the other hand, don't. In the US, we have a very fragmented fire service system. It's driven from the bottom up by local government. There are programs at the state and federal level to try to improve efficiency and consistency, but there's no real federal norm. And while we've adopted standards or developed standards to try to encourage consistency across the United States, there's still quite a bit of local variability. And that often creates some inefficiencies and even waste. It's also caused local fire services, as they've striven to be more cost effective, to engage in a broader range of services, many of which have little or nothing to do with fire, but do have something to do with emergent needs within the community. So we've sort of become all hazards responders. The calling fire service agencies in the U.S. fire departments is almost anachronistic now. In New Zealand, the service is organized at a national level. It began as a very local service like the United States. But by the 1970s, the country had decided that it really couldn't afford that inefficiency and nationalized the fire service. And that effort has gone through a few phases to get to its current form in the embodiment of Fire and Emergency New Zealand. I was there during the last phase before that, where the New Zealand Fire Service was engaged in a pretty comprehensive reform movement to in some ways professionalize the service. That's not to diminish the contribution of volunteers. Volunteers can be very professional, but it was about raising the skill level and focusing us more on proactive interventions and preventive interventions rather than simply emergency response. So my role in New Zealand was to help facilitate that transition by introducing engineering methods into the way that the service conducted many of its business operations. And that included not just the fire safety interventions that are typical of AEC regulation, but also thinking about how to use risk-based methods of operations research and systems analysis to think about fire service deployment, to improve fire service training, and to operationalize some communications infrastructure and efficiencies across the organization. So one of the things we did is we developed a GIS-based platform that all of our stations could engage in or engage with to do their business planning. So they could see the relationship between where they were going for incidents and what they were doing in the community and what their goals were to fulfill business plan requirements, how that aligned and how they were making progress. So it wasn't just about emergency response, it was about reducing risk and reducing the number of incidents they attended.
So since you had the opportunity to work on so many projects, both international and local, can you share what is the most interesting project you worked on, or maybe what is your favorite project and why?
Well, in the public sector, the working for the New Zealand Fire Service, probably the most interesting project was the effort to completely reform our fire safety program. So when I got there, we were still doing investigations in a more traditional way, fire investigations. And we really tried to up the game so that we were learning more from incidents. That helped us both on the forensic side, where we had criminally set fires and needed to prosecute or work with police to prosecute offenders, but it also enabled us to capture more information than we would through the traditional incident reporting system, and to validate that information so we could then use it to advise governments, both at the national and local level, on fire safety interventions. New Zealand has a performance-based building code, so evaluating bespoke solutions, performance-based solutions for buildings really requires the practitioners and regulators to have an intimate knowledge of fire behavior, human behavior, the interactions between people, buildings, and fire. So our fire investigation program is very much aimed at trying to inform those judgments. So as a result, we had to introduce some pretty sophisticated training to raise the skill level of our fire safety officers and embed within that structure the fire engineering unit that I had joined when we got there. I think we were able to make some really significant strides there by introducing fire safety officers to some fairly simple but direct calculation methods, so that when they did a fire investigation, they could test their assumptions using the same techniques that we use to design fire safety systems.
Mark, you are currently the chair of the IFE, which is the most well-established organization for those in the fire sector. You have a very high position within the IFE, even though you're based in the United States. So, how did you get involved into this organization?
Well, I first became aware that IFE existed when I was deployed to the United Kingdom with the U.S. Air Force in 1983. And by luck, I was deployed to what was then known as an emergency war readiness base in Norfolk, called RAF Sculthorpe, which just happened to be close enough to Norwich that I got it on one of my days off from duty. I made an excursion to the Norfolk Fire Brigade. And at the time, the chief fire officer of Norfolk was the international president of IFE. And I was encouraged fairly aggressively by the staff at Norfolk Fire Brigade to look into IFE. I did, and I was intimidated by that. This was in 1983. So it took me till 1994 to apply for membership. And when I did apply for membership, I was grateful to be approved. But we didn't have a U.S. branch operating at that time. So I was kind of this isolated IFE member, and I gradually became aware that I was one of a handful of other U.S. members. And fortunately, another member here in the U.S. Took the initiative to try and identify how to form a U.S. branch. And I was fortunate to be one of 8 people invited to the organizational meeting of that branch in 1996. And that led to me becoming one of the officers of the branch, and I've been involved ever since. So we've grown that branch from those original 8 people in 1996 to about 500 here in the U.S. today. We operate differently than other fire organizations in the U.S. in that it's not simply a matter of send your check and you're a member. We check your qualifications and admit you to membership at an appropriate grade. Everyone can be admitted at some grade, but full members must have appropriate academic qualifications and experience to be admitted to voting membership. That's a little intimidating to folks here in the U.S. So we've worked really hard over the past several decades to introduce crosswalks for U.S. qualifications to the UK frameworks that the IFE's qualification system is based on. And that's enabled us to do the same in other countries to create more pathways to membership and become a much more international organization. Today, roughly half of our members are now overseas outside the UK.
And what are your further plans regarding IFE? Do you have a plan to get more people involved within the U.S. branch?
Well, we have plans to get more people involved globally. I think there are 2 major things that we're trying to do. One is establish at least one new branch each year. That's to enable us to, branches are our way of enabling members to network with one another, for us to extend CPD opportunities, for members in different countries to make their peers in the global fire engineering community more aware of issues that may be unique or emergent in their communities that will affect others in due course. Grenfell is a great example of that. Grenfell's been a preoccupation in the UK, but the Grenfell Tower fire was not the first, and certainly not the only fire involving composite cladding that led to a large loss. It was just the only one that killed 72 people. So we've been able to take advantage of our understanding from Grenfell and apply it to circumstances across the developing world and the developed world to try to create a more integrated and consistent response to that problem. So the first area is just establishing new branches. The second is encouraging more members at the technician grade. So people who are earlier in their careers, don't wait like I did until you're sure you're qualified. You know, I took 11 years to apply for IFE membership, trying to get people earlier in their career to identify IFE as part of their career development path. Because one of the things that distinguishes IFE from other institutions is that we're very much committed to developing members of the profession across their careers. This is not a slight against other engineering institutions, because the third pillar is developing a much closer working relationship with the other major fire engineering body internationally, the Society of Fire Protection Engineers. Because of the unique circumstances in the US, the SFPE has been very focused on registration of professional engineers, or what we would call in the UK and in Europe, chartered engineers. And that to some extent has limited their ability to reach out to technicians and technologists, or what we call incorporated engineers. So we're looking to align ourselves much more closely with SFPE to promote the profession globally and encourage more engagement with practitioners and professionals below the grade of chartered engineer.
These plans are, these plans are good news for our listeners.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's one of the things that we've really focused on is the development opportunities. I think the other thing that's aligned with those two development opportunities is the two major emphasis points for the chief executive and myself this year and next are professional ethics, understanding ethics beyond the rule-based order, so that people understand the moral underpinnings of professionalism and professional practice. And the second, and I think it's closely related to that, is understanding our obligations beyond people to the environment and to intergenerational equity. And in that sense, we're talking about sustainability and renewal. The fire industry, unfortunately, has been involved in the development of technologies that have been harmful to the environment. We've had, you know, we saw the Montreal Protocol phase out halons in the mid-1980s. They were a very effective firefighting agent. They were widely used, but they were burning a hole in the ozone layer and threatening life on the planet. So we had to curtail their use and eventually discontinue their use. We still have other agents that have long-term health effects that are being widely used in fire protection. It's incumbent on us as practitioners to look for better ways to solve those problems that have less impact on the environment and less impact on future generations and less impact on people from a chronic standpoint. Fire is an acute risk, but it's hard to say that the risk of dying in a fire is any more important or urgent to address than the risk of dying from cancer because of exposure to toxins that have been introduced into the environment to reduce fire risk.
Indeed. Actually, I know that earlier this year you went to Swaziland on your holiday where you did some pro bono work with Daniel Antonelli. Can you tell us more about that work?
I actually was in Somaliland, which is a self-governing portion of Somalia up in the northwest part of the country. After the 1980s, late 80s civil war in Somalia, the people in the northwestern part of the country declared independence in 1991 and established a self-governing Islamic state. The area is home to a primarily, up until recent years, a principally nomadic people who've gradually become more settled in urban areas. Hargeisa is the largest city in Somaliland. It's situated in the northwest part of the country, not too far from Ethiopia and Djibouti. And more than 2 million people live in Hargeisa out of the roughly 3.5 to 4 million who live in Somaliland as a whole. As a consequence of urbanization, rapid urbanization in a country with very, very limited infrastructure, they're especially vulnerable to fire. And back on April 1st of this year, on the eve of Ramadan, they had a fire in the principal market in downtown Hargeisa. This market was typical of bazaars or marketplaces in developing countries, and it was very crowded. It was very open, unsegregated, had very little protection, and that fire swept through the market over a period of several hours, destroying an estimated $500 million to $1.2 billion worth of goods. In a country with a gross domestic product of about $3 billion, that's an enormous economic loss. There were no deaths, but about 28 people were injured in the course of assisting firefighters in controlling the fire. The British office, which maintains a diplomatic presence in the country, invited Kindling, a nonprofit that I'm associated with, into the country to perform a baseline fire safety assessment. And, it's awfully easy for us to approach this as a purely engineering problem and say, what technologies could we employ to detect, respond to, and mitigate loss? But in a country that has such limited infrastructure, for instance, there's no reticulated water system in much of the city. So connecting to water mains to provide fire protection isn't an option. Most water that's used in the community is stored in tanks on each individual site, even for drinking and sanitation. So, we had to look at this from a much more holistic perspective and say, what's the capacity of the country to engage fire safety? How aware are they of the threat? What skills are available? What resources are available? And how can those be mobilized? And there's a temptation after a large loss like this to think only in terms of regulatory responses. Our mission was to not only look at what government could do, but what government and the private sector could do together and how they could leverage civil society organizations to engage in a more integrated approach, more integrated response to fire safety that could be reflected in the rebuilding of the market. And so some of the recommendations we made had to do with how they organize tenants and how they organize and inform one another as they go through the design and rebuilding process, but also how they decide to operate the market. One of the challenges for them is they're going to go from having everything on one level at street level to having a multi-level facility in order to try to decongest the marketplace. If you're familiar with these types of facilities, it's not like a Western shopping mall. Nobody wants to be on the second or third floor, all the traffic, all the good actions on the ground floor. So making decisions about how to allocate space will become much, much more critical to fire safety. And, in the past, there was no logic to how enterprises in the market were organized. It was sort of a first come, best dressed arrangement. And they need to be more thoughtful about that and more deliberate, more intentional about how they organize those activities in order to facilitate commerce on all three levels. And that, if we don't do that, we won't have a safe environment.
Mark, I think it's obvious for everyone that you're very passionate about fire safety and you love your job. You want to make the world a safer place. So I think you're the right person to ask what's so rewarding about the career in fire.
I just think the sense of doing something important has always been what's motivated me. It was part of the reason I was drawn to the fire service initially. The fire service fulfilled two needs for me. One was to always have something interesting and challenging before me, but the other was to have the sense in addressing whatever that challenge was, that I was doing something valuable to others, not just valuable to me. I've never seen my role as a fire engineer or fire service officer as a job. I've always felt kind of called to do this in some higher level way. And that calling has meant that I've listened for opportunities that many other of my peers haven't had. You spoke about this earlier. I have a lot of experiences because I haven't been reluctant to take advantage of opportunities, even if they resulted in a nearly 180 shift in my focus as a fire safety practitioner. That's given me the opportunity to do just about everything this field has to offer at one time or another. Now, some people find that undesirable because they like to be in an area where they're comfortable and can focus on one thing and become expert in that. I like the variety, and I'd like to think that I've become sufficiently expert in each of those things that I haven't let the team down, where there are people in those positions who really are just committed to doing that one thing well, because I respect those folks as well, and we couldn't be a successful profession without them. But the most rewarding thing to me is not being pigeonholed.
After discussing the importance of having a degree in fire engineering, which had an impact on how you end up having a successful career, I would like to turn our attention to those who wish to one day follow your footsteps. So, what advice would you give to an engineer at the beginning of their career?
A couple of things. The first thing is, some of us go into engineering because we're good at math and science. Never forget that people are part of this problem. Many of our curricula in engineering are focused almost exclusively on the math and science aspects of fire engineering. I would encourage practitioners to avail themselves of opportunities to learn from social science as well. Our discipline really does rely on its ability to influence others and to understand how people appreciate and facilitate the fulfillment of their needs and aspirations. So I would suggest that a well-rounded fire engineer also has exposure to the social sciences and a strong affinity for that. The second is, don't miss an opportunity. Every time you have an opportunity to learn something new, seize it with both hands and squeeze all the juice out of it. Don't have a view of who you can learn from that's so narrow that you don't learn from every opportunity. I've been very fortunate to have been exposed to a huge variety of people over the course of my career, and I've tried to learn from every one of them. I've had the opportunity to learn from some of the brightest minds in our field. I consider people like Vito Bobrowskis and the late Brady Williamson among my closest friends. You know, Vito invented the cone calorimeter and did his PhD at Berkeley with Brady Williamson. Brady was a brilliant mechanical engineer, but he was one of my closest mentors on a published paper that we did together in 1999. It was about values-based fire safety, how the social sciences, how we appreciate what's important to people should influence how we solve technical problems. And Brady was always very encouraging of that, because that was something that was of concern to him too. I've had some brilliant fire service officers in my career who've taken a chance and said, you know, this guy who went and got a degree can offer something here. They've allowed me the space to engage with problems of concern and interest to them, and not treated me as some pointy-headed academic who, you know, doesn't understand the real world. And so I think that we learn things from people we don't expect to, and in surprising places, if we keep our eyes and ears open.
Thank you, Mark, for your advice. And here you have it, guys. Many thanks to you, Mark. I know how busy a fire engineer can be, and it's actually 7 a.m. where Mark currently is. So we really do appreciate you speaking to us today.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you for such enlightening questions. I think practitioners can learn a lot from your other guests. I see some of the other people you've interviewed, many of whom are close friends and dear colleagues. So thank you for including me in that list.